So today, Jesus is better than Moses. All right, so we're going to start. We're going to start in chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles, you can go to chapter 3. It'll also be on the screen. And so, dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those called to heaven, think carefully about this Jesus whom we declare to be God's messenger and, so now we've got a new title here, high priest. And we're not going to get into the high priest today, but we will in the coming weeks. So he's right in verse 1, he starts off with a few things that we need to kind of stop and consider. First of all, he called us brothers and sisters. So he's reminding us, and this is super important, that we're part of a family. When you decide to follow Jesus, you become God's children, which is pretty amazing to think about, that God would do that. Like, he doesn't have to. And so the Bible reveals God as primarily a father. Now, it reveals him as other things too, but primarily reveals him as a father. And not like an earthly father, he's different than earthly fathers. We share the name Father, but he's a perfect Father, and he's perfect in love. And if you can imagine a perfect father, he's more perfect than that, because he's more perfect than your imagination. There you go. And so we're God's children, and so this is really significant. And the writer of Hebrews is reminding us to start, hey, this is who you are. Remember this, because this is where we're going. And then he says the word partners. We're partners. And I was, okay, so is there significance there? Yes. So he's starting off by giving us this is who you are. So you're a part of God's family, and we're partners. So I think this partners means two things. Is that the people who follow Jesus in the generation before us, we're partnering with them. We find that out later in Hebrews chapter 12, calls it a great cloud of witnesses. And so we're not just the next generation that's following Jesus, that there is a partnership between us and those who have gone before us. It's kind of cool, because they're part of our family history now. It's like, yeah, this is a family. But secondly, it's also that God's partnering with us. Meaning, like, we're not his minions just to go do his bidding. It's more than that. It's a partnership. It's a family. It's a partnership. So he's giving us these different metaphors to kind of go like, hey, this is a significant relationship you have with God here. And finally, he says, before he launches into Jesus is better than Moses, to think carefully about Jesus. So thinking is, I think, really important. The Bible actually talks about it quite a bit, especially in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well. In fact, one of the most famous texts from the Old Testament is to love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. Wow, your mind? And so ultimately what that means is that we think carefully, we honor him with our mind. It's not just what we think about, it's that we're willing to think deeply. And carefully is the word that's used here. So we think carefully about Jesus. And when we do that, we are less likely to start thinking that something or someone else is better than Jesus. And so he's giving us a little tip here, a little clue. When we think carefully, when we consider Jesus, later on in chapter 12, it says, consider him, meaning consider Jesus, or fix your eyes on Jesus. So this is the same kind of language. Think carefully about Jesus. This will help you in life, trying to figure out what to do, where to go, all sorts of things. To consider Jesus, consider him. When you're going through tough times, and specifically this is the one in Hebrews chapter 12, consider him who endured such, sorry, I forget what it says, endured such hostility from sinful men. Okay, let's keep going. Starting verse 2. For he, talking about Jesus, was faithful to God who appointed him, just as Moses served faithfully when he was entrusted with God's entire house. So it's talking about the people of Israel when it says his entire house. But Jesus deserves far more glory than Moses. Just as a person who builds a house deserves more praise than the house itself. And so he's comparing the builder with a person, of course, and the house is an inanimate object. So, I mean, that's how much greater the glory goes to Jesus than it does to Moses. For every house has a builder, but the one who built everything is God. Moses was certainly faithful in God's house as a servant. His work is an illustration of the truths God would reveal later. But Christ, as the Son, is in charge of God's entire house. So we're gonna go through some of these comparisons in a minute here. And we are God's house. Oh, what? Did you guys catch that? Who's God's house? You guys are like, we or us? Yeah, we're God's house. If you're a follower of Jesus, he comes to dwell. So there's this idea that, God dwelled, his physical presence dwelled in this, in the temple, the Holy of Holies. And the writer of Hebrews, I'm not going to talk about it too much today because we're going to get to it later on. But this is in mind because I think I'm not going to guess which chapter it is, but it's ahead of us, and we're going to talk about it. But that's where the presence of God dwelt. And so it was considered that God dwelt in the temple. But when Jesus rose from the dead, the Holy of Holies, this place where God's physical presence dwelt, was there was a curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. And the curtain, when Jesus died, just was torn in two. Not by, somebody mad or whatever. It was like, just torn in two. God did it. Representing the fact that now that God's physical presence, his dwelling place was no longer going to be in this small physical location. That God was going to build a new house. And we find out, Peter talks about this in 1 Peter, that God's new house is his people that he dwells within. It's pretty cool. Not pretty cool, it's very cool. And we are God's house if we keep our courage and remain confident in our hope in Christ. Okay, so first thing that we gotta knock off here is why Moses, right? So we had angels. Okay, we get angels now, but why Moses? What's up with Moses? Okay, so the Jews felt if there was one character that the Jews would elevate above all others in the Old Testament, it would be Moses, right? There's lots of great characters, Abraham, they would all these are amazing people. But Moses, there was something about Moses, especially in the first century. And so the law, why? Is because the law, which the Jews followed, the law was given to Moses. He's the one who received it. And so whenever we hear his name, especially if you were a Jew, you would think of that covenant, the first covenant, the covenant that God made with his people in the Old Testament. And so what the writer of Hebrews is doing here is he's comparing Jesus, a better messenger, that we learned this last week, a better messenger, gives us the second covenant. So a new covenant. And it was based on grace. It was based on his death and resurrection. That was initiated by his blood. He was the sacrifice. And so we have a better message, we have a better covenant, we have a better messenger. So this is the first comparison. And so to a Jew, this would have been like, oh, what? Can't be better than Moses. Oh yeah, Jesus is better. And for all of these reasons. And so who is Moses? Well, Moses delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. So, we'll just start the story in Egypt. So Moses was born in Egypt, and people had already been slaves for 400 years. And at the time, the Pharaoh was like, there's just too many of these boys being born here to the Israelites, so let's just kill all the babies, all the baby boys. There's just too many people. And And so Moses' mother hid him. And so he wasn't killed. And he was found, and in the story, it's so obvious that God was, orchestrating this whole thing. He was found by an Egyptian princess. The Egyptian, this is like a movie, and it is a movie. The Egyptian princess finds him and adopts him, and he grows up living in the Egyptian palace. Well, one day Moses is out walking, I don't know, maybe walking his dog, I don't know what he's doing, but he saw an Egyptian slave master beating one of the Israelites, and he got angry, and he killed him. He beat him to death, killed him, and then hid the body. It's like, what? Yeah, that's Moses. And so he had to run from Egypt. And so Moses ran away from Egypt and spent 40 years in the wilderness. I can't imagine what it was like for 40 years, going I grew up in the palace and now I'm out in the desert. He did meet his wife there, though, so that was good. But 40 years later, God calls him to come and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery. And so he fights with God a little bit about it, but in the end, he does. And so if you're reading this text and you're a Jew, you would be thinking of that. And so Moses delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. But Jesus, in our passage, we find, delivered humanity from slavery to sin and death. Right? So you see how much Jesus is better? So what Moses did was amazing. But think of what Jesus did. So Moses took a people out, but Jesus died for the entire world to save us from slavery to sin and death. So Moses was God's faithful servant, right? It called him a servant in our passage and was held in high esteem. But Jesus was God's faithful son, right? So we have this comparison. Moses is the servant. Jesus is God's faithful son, deserving of, it said, far more glory. Finally, we have Moses interceded to God on Israel's behalf. Throughout Moses' time leading Israel, he interceded for them multiple times. And we'll find out as we keep going why he had to do that. Israel kept, their hearts were hard, is what our passage tells us in the next section here. And they kept rebelling, pushing back against God. So let's get back into it, starting verse 7. That is why the Holy Spirit says, today, when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as Israel did when they rebelled, when they tested me in the wilderness. And so here's the story, rest of the story. So Moses goes back to Egypt. He leads the people out of Egypt after Pharaoh continually said, no, you can't take these people away from me, I want them. God would send one plague after another. Pharaoh would go okay, you can take him now. Then change his mind. Till finally the last plague, the firstborn of all the Egyptians died. And that was it for Pharaoh. That was the next in line, right? And so the people and the Pharaoh would have thought this himself, that the Pharaoh was God. I'm a god. That's what he would have thought. And so now his son had died. That this other God, this God of the Israelites, had taken his son. And so he finally relents and lets Israel go. So Israel, and there's probably more than 1 million Israelites at this point. And it's women, children, animals. It says actually they plundered the Egyptians when they left. So the Egyptians, I'm thinking more it wasn't forcible plunder. It was just here, take this, take this, take this. I don't want any more of this stuff from your God that's killing us. And so it would have been slow going. And it's really interesting. It would have been quite something, because during the day, there's a pillar of cloud that God was in that led the people of Israel. During the night, it turned into a pillar of fire. Is that awesome? Can you just imagine that? Would that not have been like, what's up with that thing in the sky? That we're following this cloud, and then at night it's like fire, and you're like, whoa, this is awesome. And so they follow follow Moses, of course, who's following the pillar of cloud, because that's what he was instructed to do. And they get to the Red Sea, and lo and behold, they hear the sound of horses and chariots and an army approaching. And the Egyptians had decided, let's go get them. Let's take them back. It'll be a fun fight, right? Because they don't have any weapons. And we'll take our horses and chariots and our armed soldiers, and we will wreak havoc on Israel. Well, you would think there'd be a lot of panic there, right? It's like, what do we do? Because there's cliffs and there's on both sides, and then there's the Red Sea. What are they going to do? Then the army's coming this way. And so God performs another incredible miracle through Moses. Moses strikes the water with his cloak or his staff. I think it's his staff. And the Red Sea parts. Now it says that there was a wind and it blew all night and somehow parted this. It was God. And so the people walk across on dry land. Well, Pharaoh's army is just like, can you imagine those? They're like, what is going on here? So you'd think they would turn around, because isn't that real evidence? Okay, so this God that sent the plagues, well, he can do other stuff. Like, look at this. But they don't. They just, there's a pathway through the Red Sea. Let's go get them. And so when Israel gets to the far side, the waters close, and the mightiest army of in the world at that time was this Egyptian army, was in one kind of done. That God defeated this army just in a snap. And so after that, they go, Israel, like, what an amazing thing, right? Can you imagine have been part of that? And then they go to this place called Mount Sinai. And God meets with Israel there, which is another thing that just blows me away. And when I read those texts, I'm like, what would it have liked to have been there? The instructions were, don't touch the mountain. And they figured out why. It was smoking and shaking, and there was fire, and it was just like, whoa, okay, we're not going to touch the mountain. That was God's instruction, because God descended on the mountain. And so this is the story where Moses went up and then received what we know as the 10 Commandments, but received the law from God, and which the Jews, and it's in Galatians, I think in Acts too, where it was given to him by angels. And so you have all of this amazing stuff. And then God speaks audibly to the entire nation, which is, he speaks the 10 Commandments. And at the end of it, I think is like pretty, well, it's not humorous, but it is. So Israel's just like, this is my paraphrase. Moses, that was really freaky. How about from now on, you talk to God, and he talks to you, and then you tell us what he said. And so they had experienced all these things. And so this is behind this call. Today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as Israel did when they rebelled, when they tested me in the wilderness. So after these incredible experiences, Moses goes up to receive the law. God has made a covenant with his people. You're my people, and I'm your God. And Moses comes down the mountain. That's about 40 days. He comes down the mountain, and he hears partying. He's like, what? It's like, oh, must be having fun. But they're not just partying. Israel has decided that they are going to worship a different God. And they take people's gold, and they make this golden calf, and they're worshiping it. This is like only 40 days after God audibly spoke on the mountain. It's like, whoa. Okay, so this is pretty crazy. And so Yeah, so this is one of the things that is in mind. And so from there, Israel goes into the wilderness, and God is leading them to what's called the Promised Land. What we know in the Old Testament calls it the Promised Land. And it's the land of Canaan. It's inhabited by Canaanites. Some of them were giants, like they were incredible warriors, incredible walled cities, and you got this, band of Israelites going to take over. But God's like, I'm going to do the fighting. I'm going to take them over. And so they send out a few spies, 12, one from each tribe. And the spies come back, and 10 of the 12 tell Israel, the whole crowd, like, we can't go in there. Like, are you nuts? You should see the size of these people. They're huge. They have like armor, and they have chariots and horses. Like, what are we going to do? But 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, are like, well, what are you guys talking about? We have God, right? So I'm thinking, they're thinking, look what we just came from. God displayed this incredible power. What army could possibly fight our God? Like, look what just happened to the greatest army in the world in Egypt. And so, but the people grumble and complain, and they align with the 10. And a judgment is passed by God at this point. And he says, none of you are going to enter this promised land. You are going to wander the wilderness, the desert, for 40 years until no one is left of this generation. The next generation is going to get the promised land. You guys aren't. So that's when they tested him in the wilderness. And then throughout that 40 years, it was rough going. There your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw my miracles for 40 years. So God fed them miraculously every morning with what we know as manna, this is bread. Tasted like honey. Like, oh, that sounds like good bread. And he provided water for them. He cared for them. He fed them. He did everything that they needed, gave them everything that they needed. And they still tested and tried his patience, even though they had saw all these miracles. So I was angry with them, and I said, their hearts always turn away from me. They refuse to do what I tell them. So in my anger, I took an oath. They will never enter my place of rest. And so there's kind of a dual meaning here, and we'll get to that next week. But for this week, this place of rest was the promised land, is what he was talking about, like the physical promised land. But the second meaning is a different kind of promised land. It's not the physical one that we think of with Israel. But we're going to tackle that next week. We can't do it today. So what do we have here? We have a hard-hearted people. It's a hard story, right? The people grumbled against God and Moses after being delivered from slavery in Egypt. See, and the writer says their hearts became hard. They rebelled against God and the covenant that he had made with them constantly, the whole time, pushback. God delivered them, took care of them, fed them, protected them, and even performed miracles for them to save them, like with the Egyptians. Or, well, all of them, like the food, miraculous food in the desert. He was so patient. But, and the writer says, their hearts always turned away. So even though God did all this for them, they continually turned away. They continually turned away from him, even though they had witnessed and experienced his love, like he chose them, his faithfulness, even through all the grumbling and complaining, like God was he was continued to be faithful to them. And not to mention the mighty miracles that he performed constantly for them. And so God's judgment is that they would not enter this place of rest, which is the promised land. Okay, so let's finish off the chapter here. Be careful then, brothers and sisters. Make sure, so this is the application, by the way. So if you're wondering, what is he talking about? Well, how does this apply to us? This is how. Make sure that your own hearts are not evil and unbelieving, turning you away, he's using that same language, right? Turning you away from the living God. You must warn each other every day while it is still called today. We'll get to the significance of that one tomorrow or next week. So that none of you will be deceived by sin. Interesting. Sin is deceitful and hardened against God. For if we are faithful to the end, trusting God just as firmly as when we first believed, we will share in all that belongs to Christ. Remember what it says today. When you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as Israel did when they rebelled. And who was it who rebelled against God, even though they heard his voice, right? They actually heard God's audible voice. Wasn't it the people Moses led out of Egypt? The answer is yes. How about another question? And who made God angry for 40 years in the desert, wandering, grumbling, and complaining? Wasn't it the people who sinned? And this is quite a stark image. Whose corpses lay in the wilderness, right? Because none of them survived, except Joshua and Caleb, by the way. How about another question? And to whom was God speaking when he took an oath and said they would never enter his rest? Wasn't it the people who disobeyed him? So we see that because of their unbelief. So all this stuff comes down to, this is why. Because of their unbelief, they were not able to enter his rest. I see our time is coming to a close here. And so here's the warning that he's going to give us. I'm going to have to go through them pretty quick. You can talk about them more in your small group if you want. So here's the warning. Ultimately, do not harden your heart. So Israel tested, grumbled, and rebelled against God. So this is what we need to do. We need to learn from their example. That's what the author is appealing to the reader. Learn from their example. Don't do what they did. Continually testing, continually grumbling, continually hardening their hearts, rebelling against God. See, here's what it comes down to. They wanted God's promises, blessings, and protection, but not his ways and not his rules. Right? So they were happy receiving all the good stuff that God promised, including the promised land. But they didn't want to follow the things that God said. They didn't want to live the way that God said is the best way to live. And so Israel's example, and I think this is important. Any of these stories in the Old Testament, it's not just a story of what happened. It reveals something about us. So Israel's example is meant to show us what's in our own hearts. Like when we read this, we can't go like, and I know I've said this a couple times because this is what we do say, so I can't believe it. Like, why in the world would they do that? These crazy people. But their example, it's meant to show us something about us. It's not just that they're crazy people. This is part of the human condition that we're in, that we constantly drift away from God, that we constantly have to fight off that rebellion in our hearts, and that we really struggle to learn from the example of others. But we need to so badly. And we need to learn from Israel's example. This is what's in our hearts. Secondly, belief isn't dependent on witnessing God's power. So I've heard this lots. If God would just do this, or something miraculous, or if he'd just show up like in human form right now and just wow everybody, everyone would believe. Well, no. He did that already, right? And what did they do to Jesus? They crucified him. They killed him. Would we do any different? Of course not. Right? We're not any different than they were. We don't look back on those crazy people. It's like, oh, they didn't recognize Jesus. No, the human condition, we drift away from God. Like, I just hope so much that wouldn't be me. And yet at the same time, I have to realize that he was rejected by all. It says rejected of men. Like, that's rejected from all humans. And so if you're waiting for something miraculous, that'll make me believe. Just read the Bible. In fact, our story today. Look what the people of Israel experienced. They heard God's audible voice, the mountain quaking and on fire. And they're like, we don't want to do this again. This is crazy. They walked across dry land in the Red Sea. They were delivered from Egypt miraculously, God sending plagues on the Egyptians. Led them into the wilderness, fed them miraculously, gave them water. And then we find out later on that God delivered them the promised land to the next generation, and Joshua led the people in. And God conquered the peoples. Like there's so many times when Israel goes to fight and God does almost all of the fighting. And yet, they didn't believe. And in the New Testament, Jesus actually says it straight out. And there's a parable about Lazarus and the rich man. Lazarus is a poor beggar. And ultimately, I don't have time to tell the parable, the rich man and Lazarus die. Lazarus is it says, in the bosom of Abraham. It sounds like a good place, I guess. And the rich man's in hell. And he's just begging for if Lazarus would just dip his finger in water and just touch my tongue. This is the agony this guy's in. And there's this conversation, and he's like, you got to tell my brothers. You got to tell my family. And in the story, Jesus kind of ends the story. He's like, even if someone was raised from the dead, which of course we know in just a few weeks later that Jesus would be, they still wouldn't believe. If they don't believe Moses, they won't believe if God's own son showed up. And of course, we have that recorded in Scripture. The religious leaders did not believe him, even though they saw all of the stuff. Miracles and signs. Why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it produce the belief that maybe we think we might have? Is because they can't change a hard heart. So if your heart is hardened, which it possibly is already if you're going like, nope, it has to be something incredibly miraculous. It won't change your heart. Because a hard heart is bent towards unbelief. Thirdly, don't build up excuses and arguments. Right? If it's just constantly push back excuses, argument after argument, but here's the thing, like I've seen people receive excellent answers to an argument or a question that they posed, and they didn't even stop to consider it. They just went on to the next argument. I'm like, oh, like they're not actually, they say they have questions, but they actually don't want answers. So that's an indication of a hard heart. You don't want to listen to the answers. And so this idea and we talk about it here at Youth a lot, wrestling with truth or doubt versus unbelief. They're different. And so wrestling is important. It's the idea of thinking. Consider Jesus. You got to think about it. You got to wrestle through it. Unbelief is different. Unbelief, it doesn't matter if you're wrestling through it. You're not actually wrestling. You've already decided. Your heart's hard. That's the difference. If you don't want to believe, there's another way to put it. If you don't want to believe, good arguments and good answers to your questions will not change your mind, because arguments and answers do not change hearts. And if your heart is hard, it won't change it. Okay, finally. Don't follow your heart. All right, so if you've watched some Disney movies, you guys watch some Disney movies? Anybody? Okay, everyone. This is you hear this a lot. It's follow your heart, right? It's this idea. It's part of our culture pushes this huge. It's this idea you look inside and you got to follow that. Well, this is a really good example of don't do that. The Bible gives you a different way. It's actually the opposite. Follow your heart is the opposite of what the Bible teaches us. So Israel's example is of a people who followed their own hearts rather than God's hearts. In fact, you find out in the book of Jeremiah, it actually says those exact words. These are a people who followed their own hearts. And I know that you're like, what? Right? Well, what are you supposed to follow? Well, here's the deal. Our hearts drift towards our sinful desires constantly. And if you look in and you try to figure out what you really desire, the outcome is the same as the people of Israel. It's the example we're not to follow. Our hearts are full of, here's why, our hearts are full of disordered desires that are trying to rule over us. And they're at odds with God's desires. And so if you're looking in instead of looking up to God and what He desires and what He says, your heart's going to get hard. And if you follow your heart, you're going to get in trouble with God. Because this is where it leads. It leads to a hardness of heart. It leads to you wanting to go your own way and fulfill your own desires rather than to go God's ways and to please Him. Okay, so last thing. This is our last statement. Today, author uses this wording, and he will again in the next chapter. Today is the right day to get right with God because Jesus is better. He's better than any other option that you're thinking of. He's better than your own option. He's most certainly a way better God than you are or me. So much better. He's the best one to you hear this kind of language, to sit on the throne of your life with me, right? Like we want to do that. We want to control our lives. But Jesus is better. And so one question as you go into your small groups to talk about this is, what's holding you back? Have you considered it? Like he talks right at the start of the chapter, consider Jesus carefully. Consider Him. So I want you to do that. Consider Him. What's holding you back? Are you waiting for the miracles? Is the stuff that we're reading about, it doesn't jive with the stuff that's follow your heart? It's different. Should be. Have you built up lots of arguments and excuses and you're not listening to good answers? Not willing to learn from the example of others? Right? If those are the things that are holding you back, well, that's just 4 things. There's lots more. Those things I think we've had pretty good answers to today.